Hello, I'm Eric Walenza, founder of IoT One, and this is the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Every episode, I interview one expert about a project that is impacting businesses today. Visit us at iot1.com to learn more, or email me to start a discussion. So, Sam, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I'm very excited about this topic, crowdsourced information streaming. I was just looking outside the window here at downtown Shanghai in the nighttime. It's a beautiful city, 24 million people. It's really an incredible vision at night, but then you think, I don't know anything about this city aside from what I can see. The data is completely hidden, so I'm really looking forward to learning about what's happening in terms of making some of this data visible, and then also what are the potential benefits, but also the potential risks to this. But before we kick off, Sam, give me a bit of background into yourself, what you're doing, so that we know where you're coming from.
Sure. So I'm Sam, and I'm based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's fairly cold out here. I'm not built for this weather, but I find myself here. And I work with a colleague of mine, and it's a small team. It's called BlueCities, and we are interested in, as you said, crowdsourced data and trying to figure out how we can connect people with the environments they live in. To that effect, our first foray into the IoT space was to build an IoT waste management sensor. So our essential philosophy was that, pollution is a major sort of passion of ours, right? We wanted to see how we can make an impact to the environment and to start off with something small. So our entire assumption is that if you can reduce a trip by a truck, one trip per year, we made a bit of an impact. And that was the essential goal. Start small and see if we can go from there. And that led into essentially now we do a lot more work with connecting people with sort of IoT-based solution, and our primary focus is using BLE for communication. But yeah, that's kind of where we are. So it's exciting times. We're just trying out stuff, and some things work, some things don't.
All right, cool. Where are you from originally? Are you Midwest, born and raised, or you said this is not really natural for you?
No, I'm from India. I grew up in India, and I moved to the U.S. for grad school. And one thing led to another, so I hopped from D.C. to New York to close to Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
All right, cool. And now I'm over in Shanghai for about 5 years now, so I guess that's the way it works these days.
Right, exact opposite streams.
So tell us a bit to kick off here, your primary business. You said you're working primarily in the city space, but who are we talking about? Who are the stakeholders that are working with you to implement projects? Who are your customers, and who are the end users that are actually using the solutions that you're bringing to the market?
Right. The space that we work on right now is more geared towards, to clarify, we won't be working the city space, but breaking into the city space is a little hard for a couple of reasons. One is that there is a lack of infrastructure, which is actually one of the biggest problems in the IoT space, getting power out to your sensors. You can use batteries, but the things die, right? How do you communicate? Those are all real tangible issues because the cities don't have infrastructures right now. So our primary customers right now are essentially corporations that have an interest, a vested interest in sort of fine-tuning their own processes, right? So for instance, if you've ever been to a convention, right? Simple example, they have a habit of emptying out the garbage cans literally every 5 minutes. You'll see people going around and just emptying stuff out constantly, right? And that is inefficient, and it's a waste of material, adds to pollution. Those are the easy sort of targets, right? So right now, a lot of our stuff is essentially the pilot phase for mainly one reason is that nobody sort of knows if they really want to invest money in this. Right? It's kind of hard. How do you get people excited about waste management? And for us, our waste management idea is more about, getting people interested in what's happening at the environment. So adding a couple of sensors that also track additional data is a fairly trivial task. In any case, right now, most of the stuff that we try to do is sort of two-pronged. The first prong is people who have waste management solutions, right? For example, people build, industrial scale garbage cans, right? So for them, it's a plus one. But the problem for them is that they typically are not the people involved in the collection of garbage. And for the people who actually collect garbage, the traditional economic model is that the more trips they make, or rather it's a fixed schedule. So for them, there's no benefit to adapting to a more responsive model. So it's kind of a hard sell. And that's why our primary target is towards corporations and see that we can show some value. And yeah, that's the kind of space we're playing in right now.
Gotcha. And I think that's quite common in the IoT space, which is that you're not just bringing a new technology to market, but you also have to bring to an extent a new business model and new business processes. Because if people continue to operate as we have a schedule every X number of hours, we empty the waste bin, that doesn't really, it's hard to extract value out of the IoT system, because the purpose of that, I suppose in this case, is to reduce the visits. So you only visit when it actually is required. So you have to actually break that business process and replace it with something else. And then you probably have to break how these guys are compensated. So they're not paid per trip, but they're paid to keep waste clean, right? They're paid to basically keep a clean environment.
Yeah, this is interesting you pointed out, right? There are sort of paradigms out there that can help in the IoT space. And the easiest way to look at it is, cloud solutions providers. You have AWS, you have Microsoft Azure, IBM Watson. All of them actually just do sort of an on-demand kind of pricing, right? So in other words, the amount of compute resources that you use, you pay for that. So we could potentially use those kind of paradigms in the waste management sort of industry, but the problem becomes scale. How do you scale out enough to sort of make money on, if you count it as fractions of resources? That's where I think the solution lies, but that's also where the problem lies.
Gotcha. No, it makes sense. But let's talk then about the data, because I think in these types of solutions, a lot of the potential value, at least, is in the data that you're providing. And so how do you envision either data being useful for the company that's actually installing the equipment, managing the equipment, or for somebody else? Could be a partner company, could be a city government. How do you imagine this data either monetized for the investor or monetized by the investor, selling to a third party?
Right. So let's consider the kinds of data that you can accumulate about an environment, right? Now, you might be interested, you live in Shanghai, so pollution is the problem. You said, it's a beautiful city, it's nighttime. So it's probably, I haven't been to Shanghai, so I can't tell if there's a bit of a haze out there or not, but I do know that air pollution is a problem out there. And I was born in New Delhi in India, which is a city that has major pollution problems as well. So in this case, there is a vested interest for governments to get involved, right? Because, it has health impacts, it has all kinds of impacts that have tangible monetary value. But, in the public sector, it's kind of hard to get the buy-in unless the city has started moving in that direction already. So you have cities like Chicago that's actually making some kind of forays into the IoT space. But when it comes to the private sector, right, I think the value is towards, oddly enough, insurance, right? So let's say that there is a vested interest in your company to maintain the facilities at a particular level, right? Maybe there's an SLA there. Maybe, as in the Midwest, humidity and mold is a problem. So I can foresee that, installing these kind of sensors that are connected to each other, that can collect these kind of data points, can prevent a problem from happening. And if you ever experience a mold problem, trust me, it is a nasty problem to get rid of. So I think the benefits are going to be more indirect at first, and that's why some of the insurance companies are actually getting into this. So I've heard that American Family Insurance is trying to make its way into the IoT space. Right now, they're going after security solutions, right, which does make sense. Now, sooner or later, I hope they're going to see the value in, knowing what's wrong or what's right with the environment. I think that's how you're going to monetize it from a completely indirect fashion. But the other possibility is that it's becoming more and more important for companies to show that they care about the people who work for them, right? So if you look at the larger tech companies, you look at Silicon Valley, they take a lot of effort to make sure their employees are happy. Right. So I wouldn't be surprised if they are also considering that, these kind of sensor data can help their employees lead a more healthier life. So if you can prove that, the air is cleaner, if you can prove that you're wasting less water, I think that can attract the right kind of talent to your company as well. So right now, unfortunately, in the private sector, a lot of the benefits can be indirect. So you're going to need the right kind of people, the right kind of companies to partner with in order for them to try out yours.
Absolutely. No, it's funny you brought up this mold example. Just a quick aside, my mother was a school teacher. This was about 20 years ago. And teaching at a relatively poor school district, she had a lot of health problems and noticed that her children, her students had the same issues. And so she brought in a mold detection kit. Without asking they took testing and they ended up closing the whole school down and demolishing the building. The infestation was so bad. And nobody had realized this literally for more than a decade, right? As students were constantly ill. And all it took was a sensor, right? One woman carrying in a sensor. That was it. So, the cost was enormous. Also the cost to the children, right? You have a lot of kids, a lot of teachers that are growing up, living in this environment. But still, you have to make the business case, right? And
there's another thing that what you just pointed out is a beautiful example of why IoT is so powerful, right? Is that in the case of your mom, she took a sensor with her, right? And you had sort of a snapshot in time, right? With IoT, you can start collecting this data and you never know what comes out of it. You might get the black swan moment that people talk about that, say 3 years from now, since you start collecting data, and now you're seeing that there's been something. So now you have the historical data to say that, okay, could this be an environmental issue? Previously, there was no way you could collect that without having sort of a real rigorous program to actively collect the data. And that typically is a research project by some university or school out there. So this is why I like the IoT space so much. It allows for the democratization of this kind of data, right? It brings the power back to the people in a fashion.
Absolutely. So let's touch a little bit more on the technology of the systems. You said you're using BLE.
Right.
What does the architecture look like for the types of systems that you're working in?
Right. So the architecture is fairly actually simple. If anybody, if you ever worked in the marketing space, right, you'll be used to the concept of beacons. Right? So we use BLE because it allows for ad hoc connections to be formed. So if you have your cell phone, you can establish a connection with a beacon. But in this case, all it does is use BLE to form the connection, get data out quickly. And it's bursty kind of communication. So you just get a little bit of data out and you walk away. And eventually, when your cell phone has, say, a network connection, you can transfer the data out. So all we have is a sensor that has a depth sensor that is sitting inside the lid of a garbage can, and it's waiting for essentially an authorized app to establish a communication. And once it does that, it dumps its data out. And so, in the case of garbage collection, you don't need real-time data, right? You need effective snapshots of data. So we rely on the fact that you have enough foot traffic to get enough information out so you can inform the people who are actually in charge of collecting the waste about what the levels is, right? But yes, you do need an app, right? And in this case, we have an iOS as well as an Android app that you install on the phone. And this is why our initial targets are corporations for a big reason, is that a lot of corporations now hand out cell phones, right? So it's easier for us to give them an app that's installed on their employees' cell phones. So it reduces the friction from having, sort of the general public just download an app versus a corporation giving them a phone that already has the app. There's sort of a lot of interconnected pieces that have to work together. And in this case, that's why corporation makes sense for us. Now, on the back end, we run everything off AWS. And essentially, it's a NoSQL kind of solution. We collect streams of data. And it's agnostic to the kind of data. So what we do is we collect raw data, and then we sort of add processing filters on top of the data. So modifying it to, say, collect temperature data or say, pollution data is fairly trivial, right? But yeah, it's fairly sort of low-tech, high-tech.
Oh, that's the beauty of IoT, right, is that it makes high-tech inexpensive so that it can be applied to use cases where 10 years ago, it just didn't make sense, right? It would be $5,000 per sensor, and now you get it down to a couple dozen dollars, and becomes something that can really be employed. So can you break down the cost structure a little bit in terms of the platform versus the hardware? And the reason I'm asking is that you mentioned that it's feasible to add other sensors onto this platform, because I guess there's the hardware, there's the software, and then there's also the service element, and potentially that's one of the more expensive, actually having somebody physically go out and install these. I'm not sure. In some cases, that's actually one of the more expensive elements. But the reason I'm asking is looking at the potential to say you already have a platform where you're installing something on a device. Now, can you add more sensing capability to this that might have value for the corporation or one of their partners or somebody else? Because we're talking here to an extent around crowdsourced information streaming, and that means to an extent the opportunity to collect data that has value for multiple parties.
Absolutely. So, in our case, right, so the two aspects of this, right, our base level sort of package, right, because a lot of this we're building off, sort of off the shelf, because these are targeted pilots, and, we haven't reached scale yet. So our total production costs, by the time we sell a unit, right, there's a difference between the unit and the actual service, right? The unit itself costs $99. And the service element is a subscription-based model, right? Which that's sort of flexible in the sense that it depends on the number of sensors that you're using. It depends on how long you're signing up for. But because these are pilots, we're just swallowing the costs. Right? Now, it comes down to long-term, how do we sort of calculate the costs out in terms of storage, in terms of network bandwidth? Again, we're fairly young that we don't have a firm grip on that. But it's going to come down between the actual platform, right? The hardware package, if you will, and the amount of cloud-based services that you're consuming. Now, that's the base platform. So what we suggest to our clients of this, or potential clients of this, right, is that we need to understand what are you trying to sense so that we can build the platform out for you, because the platform itself is fairly modular, right? But we've got to find the right kind of sensor that can operate within those environmental parameters. Does it handle the temperature well? Is it susceptible to noise? Is it susceptible to dust? That kind of stuff. So we do an initial audit to figure out what kind of configuration makes sense. And typically, that's sort of a fixed cost if you think about it, right? If you need, say, a carbon dioxide sensor, you need a carbon dioxide sensor regardless. So you can shop around to find the cheapest one or the most effective one for the price point. So the actual platform itself is sort of a fixed cost, and that can be eliminated in a fashion based on subscription model. So it's a subscription model that we need a lot more thought about, and frankly, that's just going to take time.
Gotcha. Okay, let's talk a little bit more now about the data. Again, there's this concept of crowdsourced information, but to somebody's installing the sensor, somebody is putting in the cost to actually collect this information. If it's going to be shared, made accessible, whether it's to a supply chain partner, to the city government, to the public at large, potentially sold to a third party that can somehow monetize it. We need to think about who owns the data, how does data usage rights, how do they transfer, how are they regulated? Is this something that you're already you're working in the space and putting thought into? Do you feel like there are some clear best practices that you can share that you're either implementing or you've seen in the market that you think makes sense?
Right. To sort of parse out this question, which is it's fairly complex. One part is who owns the data, right? Because our initial targets are corporations. The corporation owns the data. Now, how they choose to share it, how they choose to monetize it, is kind of up to them, right? But they own the data. So we don't resell it, right? It is essentially in an isolated condition for them. They have access to it and they own it. Now, there is a part that we do that we sort of insist on. We try to anonymize the data at all costs, and there's a reason for this. So let's say that you have a humidity sensor near the coffee machine, right? And you have your employees that, they have it on the cell phone, right? And suddenly 6 months from now, somebody gets a bright idea. Hey, we can use this data to find out who takes the most coffee trips and sort of penalize them for for essentially drinking a lot of coffee, right? Because productivity is down. So we want to protect the users because, in a fashion, yes, you are employees of the corporation, but also you're an individual, and we want to protect, being able to essentially hack your whereabouts, right? So these are the kind of things that are going to become more and more important. On a more nefarious scheme, let's say you have publicly sourced data, right? And you decide that data is always going to be tagged by some kind of unique ID, right? Now, you may not know what the unique ID is, but given enough sort of time series of where that unique ID was found, you could potentially track somebody anonymously at first and then start finding out more about that person, right? So if they pass, say, a particular lamppost at 9 a.m. every day in an isolated place, you go ahead and decide that you're going to go have surveillance over there. And now, you see, the problem is that if we don't protect the users who are helping out, because essentially they're helping out, they're carrying something on their body to help out a greater cause. If you don't protect them, then it can have negative ramifications later on. So right now, the only mechanism we have is sort of we anonymize the data, right? So there's no way to backtrack it, right? But it's still not good enough, right? And we're still trying to think of solutions, or actually we're still trying to think of the kinds of problems that can arise from the fact that that when a person is contributing to helping towards collecting data, that we can backtrack and figure out certain habits, So how do we prevent that from happening? But in general, the only best practice out there right now is what we're doing is just anonymize the data. What else can we do at this point?
Right, and interesting. You're thinking, how do we best prevent backtracking to understand habits? Obviously, there's other teams that are thinking, how do we backtrack in order to understand habits? I think we won't name and shame any companies here, but there was a company that was recently in the news for tracking employee trips to the bathroom, right? So, very similar case. But also, I think we're going to come up upon a lot of situations. So there's a company in China, a bike sharing company, been tremendously successful. They've raised almost $500 million in 12 months since launching. So a very, very successful company. And it's a great product. It's made anywhere in the city. You can find a bike somewhere on the street. You can pick it up, scan it with an app, scan a QR code, unlock it, drive it anywhere else in the city, and just park it, lock it, and walk away. So there's no bike stand. It's just a bike sitting somewhere on the sidewalk. Pick it up, drive it, park it. So a beautiful solution. It cost 15 cents, literally 15 cents for half an hour. So it's practically free. And of course, the monetization model is that if you know that every day I get off work and I bike along some route, you know what stores are along this route. And you can start to send me some targeted ads to encourage me to shop or go buy your wife a pair of shoes because there's a sale at this store that you're going to drive your bike along on the way to the metro, right? And this company, it's a fantastic company, but in order for it to be a really profitable company and pay back the investors who gave them $500 million, they're going to have to monetize this data, right? They're not getting it from the payment. And so we're going to have to figure out, I guess, a couple questions. One, do customers care? Am I going to be okay with that? And then two, if I'm not okay with that, how do I opt out? How do the regulators address this? What's your opinion of the current situation today in terms of regulatory protection of the right of an individual to opt out, to control their data? Do you think that we're taking proactive steps, or are the regulators pretty much a few steps behind the technology here?
Yeah, so this is interesting, right? So again, with IoT, everything is sort of layered. There's a lot of nuances out there. So let's consider from your example that a person has his app and he or she can unlock this bike and ride along and essentially use it for pretty much for zero cost. Now, there is an implicit understanding, or even an explicit understanding for the matter, between the consumer here and the company that you're going to use our bikes and we're going to serve the advertisements, right? So that is probably acceptable. Would the user care? Probably not. It depends on the user experience, right? But if they start sharing out that information, right, that becomes a little bit more tricky. Now, you do have an existing model out there, right? It's not that different from going to a website, right, and having essentially, third parties being informed about your browsing habits, so that the moment, let's say I go to CNN.com, right, and I do certain, I'm browsing around a little bit out there, and next time I go to some other website, I'm served up an advertisement that's kind of uncannily similar to what I was looking for. Now, people kind of accept it, but people can also kind of, you can't really opt out of it, so you use blockers for that, right? Now, so, I don't think regulations keep me up far enough. Now, the space where there are better regulations is actually in SMS, right? So, for instance, let's say that you have a subscription model, there's certain keywords if you text, they have to respond in a particular fashion, right? So you can say stop, for instance, it'll stop a subscription, right? If you say help, it has to provide you certain kinds of information, and it allows you to opt out from that particular service. So it's interesting that, SMS has far more protection, in my opinion, than, say, web browsing. Now, in this space, it's not that different, as opposed to a digital cookie, kind of a physical cookie, right? Is that you're driving around and riding around, and a certain information about you is being collected. Now, how it's being shared out, the only way to opt out is essentially stop using that service, right? And this is the tricky part. What happens to that existing data? Do they still own it? Who owns that data? So again, it's these problems are not sort of unique to IoT, except IoT has the other added element of the physical presence of you, right? You can constantly be tracked if you opt into these kind of services. Facebook has the same issue, like who owns the data, right? A lot of people don't realize that they may not own the data. They may not even own the copyright in certain circumstances. So again, I don't think that there are enough regulations out there, but primarily because even industry hasn't solved the problem yet. You ask 5 different people, you're going to get very different responses, right? And for me, government always kind of lags behind the industry, and until the industry itself figures out, what the ethics of these kind of solutions are, I don't think you're going to get enough regulations. You might get hastily thought out regulations, which could be worse than the problem itself. But right now, I don't think there's anything out there. So essentially, it's sort of the Google model: do no evil, right? Until you start doing everything else.
Yeah, until it turns out to be very profitable to do a bit of evil here and there. So we've talked about a couple issues here. Certainly security, privacy. What about the customer awareness, the ability for a customer to scope out a problem, more or less rationally assess what their options are? This is something that we encounter quite often at IoT One, which is looking at, for example, an IoT platform. How does a company assess 4 different vendors and make a rational decision which platform is best for them? Who is making that assessment, right? If it's maybe a platform that's going to be used in a manufacturing environment, but it's maybe essentially an IT platform. Maybe it's going to be maintenance who's actually operating the platform once it's in place. You have different stakeholders that are involved in this decision. So who is actually going to be making that assessment? What criteria are they going to apply? So I think because of the interface between IT and OT, you have more complicated decisions than you had before. In your market, what is your feeling for your customers' ability to kind of scope out what you're doing for them, understand what the value is, and to what extent are they still in discovery mode, trying to figure out who should make the decision and how to make a decision?
Right. Now, see, every client that we have talked to, right, from the get-go has had, a lot of principles involved, right? So you have a mixture of IT, you have a mixture of facilities management, you have a mix of sort of finance, right, because there's costs involved. And essentially it comes down to there's typically one decision maker that we've always found that, if it goes forward or not. And typically that person is kind of interested in the IoT space and they see the potential. But it's unfortunately a gut feeling for most of these people, right? Because it's very hard to evaluate something that's fairly nebulous, right? Especially when it comes down to their own facilities. Because we can make the claim that, listen, we're going to save you 20% of your waste management costs. And, we're not going to make that claim because, we can't prove it. Every situation is different. Again, you have a physical space, right? And the nuances there are far more complex. And B is, they won't even accept it, even if you can make a reliable claim, is because they don't have the data in context of their own institution. If you ask a person, right, what does it cost you, to empty out a garbage can? They don't have an answer. They just think that they typically, it's almost as if it's kind of a logistic regression problem. They either have it's too expensive or it's not expensive, right? Or it's affordable. They can't quantify it, right? It's because they haven't yet gone down to the level of that one unit level, right? So again, to answer your question, you have a whole bunch of people involved, from facilities to IT, right, to finance, but in our experience, it's always been that one person is willing to drive and try out adoption.
Well, where does that one person tend to come from? Are they usually from executive management, from the head of a particular function, or from IT?
Oddly enough, it comes from somebody with a significant marketing background. And I'll explain why. Right? Is that because they have been exposed to BLE for a while now. They jumped on the Beacon bandwagon a long time ago, right? And Beacons turned out to be slightly disappointing, but they never lost a love affair with BLE, right? Because this concept of ad hoc connections, right, is fairly powerful, right? Being able to, you're walking by and things are just happening, right? The user friction is zero. I don't ask you to take out your phone and launch an app, right? The moment I ask you to take out your phone and launch an app, it's interruptive, right? And there is no next step. In the case of a bike issue, right, there is a next step. You take out your phone to unlock the bike, to ride the bike. In other words, there is a logical next step. But when I'm passively collecting data, there is no logical next step. So for them, the concept of using BLE is still there. It's ingrained in them. So typically, it's the marketing people who actually are far more progressive and forward-thinking. And, a lot of the organizations are, if not formally having an innovation officer, right, are going in that direction. And quite a few companies are actually poaching marketing talent to sort of head that up. So that's the kind of person who typically is there driving it. Plus, they need big wins quickly. And they see this as a viable opportunity to have a quick win.
Okay, interesting. So it's actually not even the department that's that's responsible for this. It's the I 4.0 lead, so to speak. Okay, just a couple wrap-up questions. Maybe first question: if we look down the horizon a bit at the city space, or more generally at the crowdsourced information space, right now when I look out at Shanghai, I have a few data points. Shanghai actually, or in China in general, they track pollution fairly well. So I have a pollution app where I can get real-time data there. Obviously, I have, my weather data. We've invested a lot over the past, 30, 40 years globally in terms of collecting weather data. I have traffic data. Maybe I have some data on crimes. I think that's about it. Where do you see us getting to the point where I can look out at the city and I can understand, or maybe less looking out at the city, looking into my laptop, and I can understand the city, and I have access to real data streams that can help me understand what's going on in the city?
This sort of brings us back to so one aspect is, what needs to take place to make this more effective, right? And what does being effective mean, right? So when we started off this our conversation today, there's something that that kind of cropped up, but not in detail, is about infrastructure, right? So until a city decides that IoT needs to be part of their infrastructure, not that different from power lines or anything else for that matter, it's not going to work. It's I find it very hard to foresee how it can work, because again, we need access to power and we need access to network communication, right? Because we need to get the data out somehow or the other. Mesh networks can take you a few places, okay, but it's still fairly limited. I still need to have access to the network sort of when required, and I'm willing to pay for it, but it needs to be there. So that's what needs to happen on a city level to allow something to take place. The other problem is, you brought up a lot of different kinds of data immediately, right? You talked about weather, you talked about traffic, you talked about crime rates, right? So you have a lot of these different schemas that are sort of going to start coming into place, right? So how do you have a software or a system that can intelligently, sort of understand these schemas, right? Extrapolate, and there's a lot of intelligence that needs to go behind it. But more importantly, as an end user, how do you make sense of what you're seeing? So this is where I think it's going to be a combination of, how you interact with the app is going to be a little different. So conversational UIs are becoming more and more important, right? So for me, let's say I'm kind of paranoid, and I am really, really nervous about shoplifting, right? No other kind of crime. The only crime I'm interested in learning more about is shoplifting because I traveled down a particular path, right? And, how do I ask the software to say, listen, is this safe because I'm nervous about shoplifting? So in other words, you'll have to get a significant amount of natural language processing, more of a conversational bot kind of deal for you to make sense of, right? When it comes to weather data, sure, I can show you a graph, but what does it mean to you, right? Let's say you're taking a trip down to, you're trying to go down the suburbs, right? Now that context, for you to derive that context or that information from just raw data from a graph or something, it's going to be harder, especially when you get more and more of these data streams. So you need to be able to ask the system or pose a request to the system and get back intelligent data. So the way the data is processed, right, is going to change, especially when you go down to the city level, right? Because you have all these different data streams that need to, A, be understood, and B, I should be able to query it in a more natural language fashion. It's almost like you need the city advisor, the person the trusted elder that you can call and say, I have this problem, or I need help understanding this, and the person can respond in a somewhat intelligent fashion.
Well, that's a great. No, I think you're spot on. That we do actually have a fair amount of data. It's just that it's in all these different silos right now. We don't have very much control of the data. We have to pretty much take it as it comes, and we're not really able to cross-analyze across data streams. So we have a bunch of siloed data that we basically accept as is, and what we need are probably better analytics, and also to an extent, we need to make sure that access to this data is possible. So if you have the analytics, you're able to get the data from whatever source, when it makes sense. Just one point on city infrastructure. I was at an event listening to a presentation by Huawei in January, and they were presenting their vision for the future, which is basically an integrated telephone pole. And one of the things that's unique in China is that there are security cameras everywhere. I think Intel does about 60% of their chips for security cameras, 60% of the business they do in China. And this is actually it's a great platform. I mean, it maybe the intent is not is perfect, but you now have a pole, right? You maybe 10,000 in a city that have internet connectivity. They have power, right? And so you can build a lot on top of that platform.
Yeah, that's interesting because Chicago also has a similar mechanism. I'm not exactly sure of the details, but there's certainly been talk about leveraging, was it traffic lights or lampposts? I forget what, but it's kind of similar concept, which is kind of where things are going to go, is because you have existing infrastructure, right? For me, if you ask me, I'd rather go crazy. Why can't the buildings talk to each other? The exterior buildings talk to each other. Those are physical surfaces that can attach stuff and potentially supply power and supply communication sort of, pathways, if you will. But yeah, I mean, that makes complete sense. That sounds pretty interesting.
Sam, let me just ask you a couple wrap-up questions here. First question, and I didn't prep you on this, but I'm thinking you'll probably have a good answer. The question is there an IoT company that people don't know about? Maybe it's flying under the radar, but you think it's doing interesting work and you'd like to mention, just draw a bit of attention to.
So this might come as odd, all right, is that there is everybody's heard of Microsoft, right? Now, they're doing some interesting work in I wouldn't say the IoT space per se, but it's a company that I'm watching out for, all right? Because when you consider Microsoft, you don't think IoT, right? But they're doing some interesting work, and they've done some interesting experiments, which make me suspect that sooner or later they're going to become a big player, So we do have a lot of small companies that seem to be interesting, right? For me, the only real successful IoT company has been Nest so far, all right? But you have these other big players out there that are doing some really interesting work. Now, for me, actually, the companies that I really am interested in seeing how they evolve are sort of Facebook and Google for a different reason. And to be clear, I have no idea as to whether they're trying this or not. all right? But they're trying other stuff that are applicable according to it. For example, Project Loon, bringing connectivity to people, right? Facebook recently tried in India to roll out sort of a free internet access service that kind of bombed because, the intent was wrong. But according to me, if they're investing in the infrastructure already, provide connectivity to people, if they open it up to IoT devices, right, it's a match made in heaven, right? So maybe Facebook should try out, don't go after people right now. How about just having a network for devices? That'll be Facebook 3.0, I guess. But, there are a lot of interesting small companies that are doing stuff out there. But for me, it's the big players that are doing stuff in other fields that if they decide suddenly that, hey, this is applicable in the IoT space, it would completely change stuff.
Yeah, no, very interesting point. I was at a connected logistics event in Holland a couple months ago, and Google had a few people there. They were very tight-lipped. They wouldn't say what they were doing, but it was interesting that they were kind of scoping out the connected logistics place and seeing, I'm sure, where their algorithms can provide value there. Sam, last question. What type of people are you looking to get in touch with, and how can people get in contact with you?
Right. So the kind of people that I'm interested in working with are people who have a passion for the environment, right? Who have a passion for providing a safer, cleaner place for people to live in, right? So typically, if there's a neighborhood, like if there's a mayor that is interested in trying stuff, right, that wants to see where they can take their, sort of their community to the next level, they're the kind of people I'm interested in working with, right? Because again, the driving of passion for us is a safer, cleaner environment as opposed to making money. Money becomes a byproduct. It's great to make it. If you don't make it, still, if you can try out something, that's great. But similar kind of people, corporations that are interested in finding out, is this truly a safe environment for my community? Those are the kind of people I'm interested in working with. And just people who have interesting sort of off-the-charts ideas. You want to try out something. There's a person who contacted us about some sort of polar expedition they were leading. And they were wondering, hey, could we put in these sort of sensor packages out there? And, because they go by once every, 6 months or something. I really didn't understand where the expedition was taking place, but I mean, it was an interesting enough off-the-wall idea that, you know what, we're willing to try. And yes, to get in touch with me, you can go to BlueCityLLC.com, right? Or you can find me on LinkedIn, and, feel free to reach out with an email or, and obviously you can share my contact information if required. But yeah, I'm always interested in learning from people and, having that initial conversation.
Awesome. Sam, thanks so much for taking the time and sharing with us today. I think what you're doing is great, and I wish you all the success.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. We help to accelerate digital transformation by advising business leaders on how to integrate IoT technologies into their operations and products. We appreciate your thoughts, suggestions, and of course your reviews. And if you have an interesting project, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. You can write me at eric.walenza@iot1.com.